As we navigate this crazy world, we must search for the truth. Then we can discover and empower ourselves to live as a free individual. Join Tammy on Journey for Truth.
Hello and welcome to Journey for Truth on iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Podcast. Thank you for joining me. Journey for Truth is on a mission to explore various topics, talk to different people, and really learn more and share the information. This week's guest is Mark Bello. He is a lawyer, a civil justice advocate, and author. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You were one of the first attorneys to sue the Catholic Church for the sexual abuse back in the 1980s, I believe. What happened in that case?
Well, it was back in the 80s. A couple of young boys had been molested by a priest. The mother came to me. She was a divorcee. The priest essentially assumed the role of substitute father, if you will, and made overtures in their lives, took them to baseball games, and in this case, a camping trip. And on the camping trip, he abused them. Unusually, for these cases, he was brought to justice. They prosecuted him. He served time in prison, 6 months. But there
How
was no
long? He was in prison for how long?
6 months. I'll explain that in a second. First of all, you got to remember it's the 80s, and while this is not a new crime and cover-up. Even then, it wasn't new. It just was less known. And these men were held in reverence, and the people who covered up these crimes were held in reverence. The Archbishop of Detroit, back then, where I live, was subsequently a candidate for the papacy. I took his deposition. I didn't know whether to call him a liar or kiss his ring. It was a very strange experience. I had seen him on television many times. I had a lot of respect for him and his office, and he goes to a deposition and lied to me. It was quite distressing. But the point is that the event happened. The priest was exposed, and he was he pled guilty in criminal court and served 6 months. What didn't happen was no one took any civil action against the priest, and the priest kept his job. After he got out of jail,
Wow.
he went right back into the priesthood and right back into positions that involved him with young kids again. So
that would
the
never.
main focus of my civil action
Uh-huh.
was to expose him and prevent that from happening, because the criminal case was very quiet. It was handled very quietly.
So, I mean, if that were outside the church, someone is prosecuted and serves time for sexually abusing a child, then they're on the sexual offender list and they're not allowed to be around children. But
Well,
he's given leeway.
and that's the dirty little secret in the church. What my book, my novel is about, is a very expansive, fictionalized version of what that cover-up feels like. I create in the novel a conspiracy. I create in the novel a subdivision of, quote, the church. I don't call it the Catholic Church. even though I think it's a thinly veiled um, uh, attempt on my part to not pick on any denomination. Um, but I created an organization called the Coalition, and they act as a conspiratorial CIA type organization within the church, whose job it is to cover up these kinds of incidents by, quote, any means possible, unquote.
Okay.
And that, while that's a fictionalized version
Hmm.
of what happened 30 some years ago, it kind of tells a story about what it felt like. I felt like there was this organized conspiracy to prevent lawyers like myself and many others who have followed me from finding out the truth. In this case, it turns out that there were prior incidents to my case. Um, why weren't those public? Why weren't they made part of the criminal prosecution?
Right.
Because they were completely covered up to the point where the four boys who were molested by this same priest earlier than my case, some 5, 6 years earlier. So that'll give you some idea of what we're talking about here. 1971, he molests these four boys in Wyandotte, Michigan. 1977, he molests the two boys that I represented. 6 years go by before the incident that I handled, and he's a priest all this time in Wyandotte and in Farmington,
Hmm.
where my incident happened. So you're looking at a cover-up that would allow him to put his hands on several more children.
Right.
In the first case, the four boys hire a lawyer, and they're offered a very small amount of money, and they take it. And they not only take it, but they're offered a few bucks more to sign a confidentiality agreement. And they agree to have the file sealed. So lawyer number two, me, can't find out that the previous case existed. And only through luck and uh, a very serious investigation on my part did we find out about the prior incidents, which created, hard to explain to your lay audience, but a priest uh, is a vows an oath of poverty. He owes his livelihood to the church. He devotes his life to the church, supposedly,
You're right. Supposedly.
and he is clothed and fed and directed by the church. So he has no money. Suing a priest is an effort in futility. You're going to collect nothing. Suing a large religious organization that covers up the crimes of a priest, now you're talking. So what I had to prove was prior knowledge of people in a higher position than he was in.
Got it.
And because they covered up completely the prior incident, it was hard to prove. And every deposition I took, I was lied to that there were prior incidents, even though I suspected that there were. You don't just suddenly start molesting two boys in your 30s. Something had to happen prior to that. And it would be a long story to tell you how I got lucky, but I got lucky. I found out about the prior incidents. I investigated them. I blew the lid off of them, and that's what changed the course of the case. Those four boys and their mother agreed to come forward, reach their confidentiality agreement, which put their settlement in jeopardy, and came forward and essentially indicated that the superior to this priest was aware of his behavior, and it was one of the reasons why he was transferred.
That's amazing. And it really sheds some light on the continued cases thereafter that have come to light regarding the sexual abuse. And of course, this doesn't apply to every Catholic church, it doesn't apply to every priest, but I think that we can see from history for the last 20, 30 years that it has happened quite often. And it's certainly something that needs to be continually investigated because I would bet that there are still some individuals being abused in the church where
Well,
it's not been.
I want to push back a little bit. You're right, it doesn't happen in every Catholic church.
Mhm.
It does happen in the Catholic Church. And
Right.
what I'm curious about and why I wrote the book um, is thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of kids have been abused who didn't have to be abused because the church had a policy to conspire to keep this silent, to pay off victims, to silence them as best they could, to pay for silence. As I told you, the prior case, um, the clients were actually paid to sign a confidentiality agreement. They got offered more money. Now, me and my clients got offered more money to do that, and I persuaded them to refuse to do that. I reduced my fee instead
Hmm.
to persuade them not to accept the confidentiality agreement. What did that do? Everywhere he went from that day forward, the case followed him. So when he was transferred from Farmington to Cleveland, Ohio, I wrote a letter to the Cleveland Plain Dealer and I said, "You have a predator in your midst." And they dismissed him and they moved him to Baltimore, Maryland. And I wrote a letter to the Baltimore paper and the same thing happened. And I lost track of him. I don't know what he did after he left Baltimore. I know he got defrocked. Um, and a very interesting things happened recently. The Michigan Attorney General, a Democrat, the Michigan governor has been in the news recently, as you know, from
Right.
the Michigan militia putting a hit out on her and all of that. She's a great lady and a terrific governor. But her attorney general has started an investigation that includes the very priest that my book is based on. He's now 78 years old. He's been defrocked. He worked under a bishop in Oakland County, Michigan, who eventually became the Archbishop of Joliet, Illinois. Why is that important? Because when this new investigation occurred in where he got arrested again and indicted, uh, where did they arrest him? In Joliet, Illinois.
Wow.
He went running right back to the person who made his career as a child molester possible by conspiring to cover up his prior crimes.
Now, this,
Whether they prosecute the Archbishop or not remains to be seen. But that's where he was arrested. And again, I'm spouting conspiracy theories of my own here. I haven't seen his name mentioned, and I don't mean the priest. I mean the Archbishop. I don't know whether the Archbishop of Joliet, Illinois, who you can find out who that is.
Mhm.
I don't know whether he's involved in this investigation, but it strikes me as very convenient that the very same man where all of this happened under his watch is the Archbishop of the very town that this priest was eventually arrested in. And one more thing about that, which was news to me, he's being investigated because of the molestation of another child in Farmington Hills, not the two that I represented. So I was lied to about that. I asked if there were other incidents in that church, in that city, and I was told no. in legal documents, in interrogatories, and at depositions. So they're not beyond lying under oath
Hmm.
and covering up crimes. And that's when you say it doesn't go on in all churches and all priests. I certainly grant the truth of that. But what bothers me the most is the higher you go, the bigger the cover up is. And,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
until this Pope came along and kind of blew the lid off of this, whether he's uh, whether his public, whether his private actions are consistent with his public words, I don't know that.
Hmm.
But what I do know is that he at least is mouthing an effort to change things. Until him, you had this vast conspiracy at very high levels in the church to prevent lawsuits from going forward, money to be paid out, lawyers to find out the truth. And it's very disturbing to me. So when you say not all, I would push back and say yes, but the church is complicit in the actions of every criminal within its um, organization.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And that is a really good point to make. Now, a lot of these the kids who were kids at the time really were silent. You know, some have come out, some have talked about the abuse, but many have remained silent. And that takes me to the more recent Me Too movement that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. It was
Right.
all over the news, it was all over the media, and a lot of not just women, mostly women I would say, but a lot of people were revealing their sexual abuse or their sexual harassment. And many would question, why did they take so long to say something, especially when the event happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Why didn't they say something? And I have my own thoughts on that, but what are your views on why victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment don't immediately speak out?
Well, I have two answers for that. Um, I must first admit that I have not represented uh, many victims of sexual harassment. I have not represented women in the circumstances that you're describing,
Hmm.
but I can call on 40 years of experience and these cases to tell you two things. One, there's actually more than two things, but one is guilt. Rightly or wrongly, for some reason or other, the victims feel guilty. How could I have been so stupid?
Right.
How could I have let this man or this woman do what they did? How can I admit that this happened and make myself look as bad as I'm going to look? So that's one problem. Another problem is power differences. If you look at Donald Trump, for instance, Donald Trump threw money at people and threatened essentially to destroy them if they came forward. And also, as I told you in the church incident, they threw money at them to get them to sign documents that prevent them from talking. When you breach that, you have to give the money back and it's probably gone or somewhat spent, or you can't afford to lose it. Um, but two, um, it's a breach of your word. You've given someone your word that you're going to keep it silent, so you keep it silent by contract. Um, I have my own opinions about the validity of these kinds of agreements, especially when they um, create a situation where the public is at risk. When you have a predator like Donald Trump running around, for instance, um, look where that leads you. Look what happened yesterday. Uh, this man has been doing stuff like this his whole career. And here he is yesterday, the culmination of this um, intimidating career that he's had, where he actually sends goons to the U.S. Capitol and has them essentially attack Congress.
And for the listeners, yesterday was January 6th, in case they listen to this or view this
It's
later
just
down the road.
it's incredible. It's just incredible. I thought maybe because I was a lawyer and because I was coming on your show today, you might ask me, what kind of crimes were committed yesterday. But and we can talk about that if you'd like. But the power difference between these two boys and the church, the power difference between a young woman and a Jeffrey Epstein, for instance,
Right.
a Donald Trump, for instance, those kinds of power brokers is huge. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of intimidation, and a concern that you're going to essentially ruin your reputation. And I think those are some of the reasons why women are reluctant to come forward, or men.
Those have been my thoughts as well. The guilt, the shame, the power difference, the being threatened, also not being believed is the case for some women. So
That's a function of power.
it is a function of power. But
Who's going to believe me over Donald Trump?
you
Not
have
today.
you have that
Today they
piece.
probably
Yeah.
would.
Yeah. Yeah. You have the piece of not just someone in a position of power, but feeling as if they won't be believed because of something else. But yes, most certainly, you take a person who was sexually assaulted by like Jeffrey Epstein. Um, there is no comparison there in terms of power. He's always, or would, he did, he did have the upper hand at the time, not anymore, obviously. Now, moving on to something else that you like to talk about, which has to do with corporate greed and influence over the government. Can you give a couple of examples of how that is interfering with us Americans?
I didn't understand your question. I heard the second part. I didn't hear the first part.
So you like to talk about corporate greed and its influence, corporations' influence over the government. And it has a tendency to interfere with our quality of life, perhaps our rights. Can you give a couple of examples there?
Well, what you're referring to, and what the dirty little secret that the public is not aware of, is that the government, I'm not even sure intentionally. I think some government officials think they're doing the right thing. But if you take the concept of what we call the frivolous lawsuit, I'm sure you've heard that term, or the term lawsuit abuse. It's used a lot correctly when someone like Donald Trump files, and I hate to keep picking on the president, but he's just a great example of what we're talking about here today. But he'll file a lawsuit at the drop of a hat over anything, whether it's a legitimate lawsuit or not. So a great example of a frivolous lawsuit, a real frivolous lawsuit, is there was election fraud in Arizona or some damn thing. That is a frivolous lawsuit. A judge quickly dismissed it, and it goes away.
Okay.
And what's supposed to happen under Rule 5 of the Federal Civil Rules is the person who brings a lawsuit is supposed to pay sanctions. Is supposed to pay the cost of the other side's having to defend that lawsuit. So when you file a frivolous lawsuit, there are penalties for that. What corporate America has done is they've taken real lawsuits and they've frivolized them, if that's a word. And you may remember, for instance, the case where the woman supposedly spilled coffee on herself.
Yes.
And collected tons of millions of dollars and sued McDonald's. And how stupid is that? How frivolous is that? This dumb woman spills coffee on herself and blames McDonald's Corporation. And what the public isn't aware of is that this woman didn't spill coffee on herself. She spilled scalding hot coffee that caused third-degree burns on her crotch because she spilled the coffee. Now, I'm not saying she's not culpable for putting coffee in her lap, um, perhaps not putting the lid on correctly or trying to put sugar in it or whatever she was doing, I forget. Um, there's a documentary about this that tells the whole story that I recommend to you. It's surprisingly called Hot Coffee. Um, if you Google hot coffee, you might get, I forget the lady's name, Susan something or other, did a great documentary on this.
Mhm.
But as it turns out, McDonald's deliberately turns the temperature up on their coffee because they want it to be hot when you get it to your office. So they turn it up at ungodly temperatures that can cause third-degree burns. Now, what difference does it make if it's your crotch or your mouth? You're going to burn yourself if you drink it right out of the drive-through. And that's what happened to her. Step one. Step two, there's a process in the law in most states that apportion fault. You don't collect 100% of your damages if you're partially at fault. Unreasonable? Yeah, right? If you're rear-ended by a car and hurt badly, 100% liability against the guy that hit you.
Right.
If you trip over something that is really obvious right in front of your face and you don't happen to be looking, and there are some defenses to that I won't get into, but let's just say that you trip over something that you should have seen. They're going to apportion why that thing is on the floor and why you didn't see it. And maybe that's a 60-40 case. Maybe that's a 70-30 case. Maybe that's a 30-70 case. But if you get $1 million, they will reduce your reward by the amount of your own negligence. So if it's 70-30, you'll get 700,000 instead of $1 million. If it's 30-70, you'll get $300,000 instead of $1 million, or 30,000 instead of 100. Whatever the number is. In this case, a jury heard the evidence, found out, and was told through documentation that there were something like 160, I think it was, prior incidents similar to this woman's incident, burns all over someone's body from scalding hot coffee because of this McDonald's policy. And rendered an award, I think it was $1.8 million, and then reduced it by 40% because of her negligence.
Interesting.
Scalding hot coffee that caused third-degree permanent burns on her legs. Now, does that sound like an unreasonable result to you?
Well, I know that it received a lot of ridicule I can't say that I have dug deep into the case, but I do remember when it was publicized and it received a lot of ridicule.
And there were a lot of
She
lies
was,
told about it.
partly responsible for spilling.
And they held her so.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is what corporate America has done with the help of the government is they've frivolized litigation, A, and B, they have lobbied Congress and state legislatures to pass what's called tort reform. They limit the amount of recovery a person can get in violation of the Seventh Amendment. Most of these statutes are Republican sponsored, and you have to ask yourself why a constitutional Republican, a Second Amendment supporter, for instance, would ignore the constitutional mandates of the Seventh Amendment, which allows us the right to sue each other civilly for amounts over $25. That's what the Seventh Amendment said.
All
So
very
who
interesting.
is Congress to restrict our right to collect whatever it is that a jury says we can collect? And that's what's going on in Congress and in big business. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, product makers, those kinds of, the US Chamber of Commerce, those kinds of organizations are trying to restrict our rights to collect damages in civil court, including, by the way, bankruptcy laws and election activity laws related to clergy abuse.
You know, one thing that comes to mind when I think of influence within the government is the company Monsanto, which has recently changed hands to a different company. But, you know, they have, as I'm sure you're aware of, and maybe the listeners are already aware, but there's been over the decades a revolving door between former Monsanto employees into the government, the FDA, the USDA. So, you know, a company like that, which is very, very wealthy, to say the least,
Mhm.
does have quite a bit of influence over the government and its decisions in regards to food.
No question, and that's my point. Money flows back and forth from lobbyists. You might recall a serious issue with breast implant cases, where silicone breast implants had defects and leakage, and it put one drug company out of business. And that bankruptcy, uh, um, the ability to limit damages by going bankrupt is, in my mind, part of tort reform. Um, Drugs that there were diet drugs there was a diet drug called fen, if you recall,
Hmm.
that caused heart defects. Um, Big pharma um, is a great example of the kinds of things we're talking about. In Michigan, where I live, a Republican governor was lobbied uh, uh, by the pharmaceutical industry, and the result was that a drug that is approved by the FDA is immune from litigation.
Yes.
So in Michigan, you cannot sue a drug maker if their bad drug was approved by the FDA.
Hmm.
Now, you and I both know that every drug that is out on the market that we can sue on has been approved by the FDA. That's how it gets on the market. Otherwise, it's a black market drug.
Hmm.
So how absurd is that? And how does that protect your citizens?
Right.
That's
Well,
the big question here. Do you protect the citizens who elected you, or do you protect the corporations who lobby you?
exactly.
And more and more, we find that government officials are more interested in protecting the corporations that lobby them and pay campaign funds and so on and so forth.
Exactly. Their pockets are lined. Many of the politicians'
No
pockets
question.
are lined. And, you know, based on what you just stated, you know, the vaccine industry is immune to any type of liability whatsoever throughout the country. So I didn't know that Michigan was specifically against any FDA pharmaceutical. That's news.
The only one in the country.
Oh, very interesting. And that's a question, you know, that I have with this new COVID vaccine is how many FDA approved drugs have to then be pulled off the market due to deadly side effects or
Well,
some other nasty side effects.
let's assume a decent amount. I'm not criticizing. Um, I mean, everybody makes mistakes. Some people pay for them, some people don't.
Hmm.
Uh, um, I'm not suggesting that necessarily, although, yeah, well, I kind of am. I'm for an unlimited court system, but let's just say I can understand um, some limits. What I can't understand is throwing citizens completely under the bus in favor of corporate profits, and
Exactly.
that's what's happening here. To your point about vaccines, I think there's a balancing test. I think there's some drugs that are so important that maybe if they have some kind of side effect that a person can sue on, maybe you limit the right to collect a certain amount of damages. Maybe you have a cap on those damages. I'm not. I'm not. I'm not adverse to a discussion about it, but to say that a company is immune when they've ruined someone's life, when they killed someone, as I indicated earlier, um, breast implants cause cancer. Uh, Serious problems with those people who had them, uh, what's the word, installed? I don't know. Uh, women who have had breast implant surgery
Hmm.
have had serious problems with certain types of breast implants. Fen caused heart defects.
Right.
Um, Certain drugs have been known to cause cancer. Cigarettes, they years ago, the big battle was, can we sue big tobacco? Um, those people who knew cigarettes would harm their health were shut out of the system. The question was, did they know rather that cigarettes could kill them? It causes a cough. It causes my voice to get a little hoarse. Um, it makes my fingers yellow. Did they know it was going to kill them when they started smoking? And when they got addicted, artificially addicted, by the way, because they increased the level of tar and nicotine in these things to addict you.
Hmm.
Did they know that? Did they know that it was so addicting that you couldn't quit, even though you know that it's going to kill you? I've seen the images where people that have these artificial, they have the surgery that takes out their larynx and they can't speak, and they have the
The
speakers,
voice. Hmm.
and they stick the cigarette in the hole and smoke through their port because they're so addicted to cigarettes. It's tragic. But the cigarette industry was very successful for a long time in preventing trial lawyers from collecting damages in cigarette cases on the basis that the public knew what they were doing and did it anyway. And that's partially true only, not fully true. And that's the problem with
And I think the takeaway that anyone can take away from this is that there's a lot out there to be questioned, and rather than being blindly following what you're told through the media, it is important to do a lot of questioning, to do investigating, so your own research to find out why certain things are allowed, why certain things have been banned, but to continue asking questions. And that's really the main point of Journey for Truth, is to keep asking those questions instead of simply following along with what you're told to do, what to believe, and how to think. Now, Mark,
well,
your books, where can people find more about your books and about you?
I have a website, markmbello.com. That's MarkMbello.com. My books are all on Amazon. They all have the word betrayal in them somewhere. Um, um, they're all legal thrillers. They're all based on real events. Betrayal of Faith, as you touched on, is based on the clergy abuse scandal and a real case I handled. Betrayal of Justice is based on the 2016 election and a fictional account of a bigoted president and how he treats the country. And it's funny, I don't know how much time you have, but I get accused a lot of doing a hit job on Trump in that book. And my response to most people is that Trump imitated my president. I didn't imitate him. I based my president on Trump's candidacy. I wrote the book in 2016. I wrote it about a bigoted president who wanted to build a wall and ban Muslims from the United States and keep Mexicans out of the country and so on and so forth. But I was talking about the candidate. I didn't know he'd get elected, A, and I didn't know he'd be as bad as he suggested he would be. So he had an opportunity to be a better president than the guy I wrote about, and he chose to imitate the president I wrote about. So that's on him, not on me. My third book is Betrayal in Blue. It's about white supremacy and a kind of a follow-up to the second book, which, by the way, is called Betrayal of Justice. Betrayal in Black is a conversation you and I could have similar to what we had, which basically tells the story of a cop on black traffic shooting based on some of the real events that we've seen in the news. And the interesting thing about Betrayal in Black today, even though it's a story of a cop shooting, is the difference between how the Capitol Police yesterday handled this all-white mob of people attacking the US Capitol versus the show of force that they displayed when a peaceful protest went on over Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd murder. What a contrast!
Very, very different between.
What a show of force contrast when the protesters are black versus white. Betrayal in Black tells the story of a traffic stop difference between a white person being stopped and a black person being stopped. I don't feel my life is in danger every time a cop stops me for speeding. A black person has a completely different experience.
Yes.
My fifth book is Betrayal High. It's about a school shooting and how the legal system might handle a school shooting, both from a Second Amendment point of view, civil and criminal. My new book, which is coming out in March, it's Supreme Betrayal. It's based on the Kavanaugh hearings loosely. And it's about a Supreme Court justice who commits a sexual assault in his youth, becomes nominated to serve on the Supreme Court, and a woman hires my legal hero, Zachary Blake, to prevent the nomination from going forward. And recently I wrote a novella about Zachary Blake's bar mitzvah, and a conversation he had with his maternal grandfather about his Holocaust experience. I have a lot of, I come from a family where there were some Holocaust victims, not direct descendants of mine, but cousins and great cousins and aunts and uncles who experienced that. And I wanted to write something about those experiences. I found this story about.
This is wonderful.
I found the story about an escape from Auschwitz that I thought was a neat little story, and I wrote a fictional account of it. That book, by the way, is available on my website for free.
Excellent.
So if people want to go to markandbello.com, they can download the novella. It's called La Dorva Dor, which is Hebrew. It means from generation to generation. And that book, like I said, is available at markandbello.com. Absolutely free.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you,
point.
Mark, for joining me. Thank you, Mark, for joining me here on Journey for Truth. And listeners, you can visit my website at empowermentthroughhealing.org. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Until next time, have a fantastic week.